I normally present a little bit more about the link between animal abuse and human violence, but we have got a number of excellent presenters from around the world doing that. So what I'm going to try and do is I want to try and pull together some of the threads of the conference and explain how that links together, how that all connects together. So I'm just going to start to share my screen now. Okay, can I just check that you can see the screen? Is that good? Thank you. So a lot of presentations I've done in the past start with like a catchy slogan, a headline, what the presentation is going to be about. So protect animals, protect people is no different. But what I'm hoping to do over the next half an hour is explain what does that actually mean and start looking at how can we turn that into actual action for animals to improve and advance animal welfare. So as Natalie said, I spent 30 years in the United Kingdom Police. My first job within the police was as a community police officer. It doesn't tend to happen in policing nowadays because of cutbacks, but community policing was a really big thing from the 1960s to about the early 1990s in police officers in the UK. Traditional police officers working the beat, working with the communities, understanding crime problems. Around about the 1990s in the UK, there was an intention to try and get ahead of criminals. Rather than detect crime, it was to try and prevent crime, to try and understand when crime was going to happen and prevent it happening in the first place. Unfortunately, one of the consequences of that was a reduction in community policing, which to a certain extent was already doing that. After I'd done that kind of preventative policing, I started doing undercover work. So started working with criminal gangs, infiltrating criminal gangs, trying to understand what they were going to do and catching them when they were about to commit a crime. So that's the kind of work I was doing. And then latterly, as I became older, as we all do, and a senior police officer, a senior detective, my main role was about strategy and looking at how we could stop terrorists entering the UK or organised crime gangs operating in the UK. So it's looking at the bigger picture is probably a bit of a cliche, but that was the kind of thing that I was looking at latterly. So, for example, I'd be looking at things like human trafficking or contract killers that would be perhaps flying in from the Caribbean to the UK, gun running teams that were operating between the different parts of England and Wales. And I now realise how many opportunities that I missed within that kind of career by ignoring animal crimes. It was never a priority for police officers. It was never taken seriously. And a particular example was a gun running team that I was looking at, which they were involved in drugs, they were involved in shipping firearms, but they were also involved in dogfighting. But we weren't interested in the dogfighting, we were only interested in the gun running. And as a result, we failed to deal with that organised crime gang. And I now realise that was a big mistake. That's led me on to certain things that I think about now in relation to tackling crime and preventing crime in the first place. I was fortunate when when we see this picture of me when I was 5 with my best friend up there, and I loved animals. And when I left the police, I was able to work with animals. I would start to actually combine some of my policing work with animal crimes and dealing with animal cases. And so I started doing undercover operations and looking at how we could expose animal abuse and exploitation around the world, working with organisations like the BBC and Vice News. And then I started going into training because I wanted to have a wider impact than just doing the exposés. And I've been fortunate to be able to train in Africa and Asia, Europe and America and Australia over the last 11 to 12 years now. And also when I can, I try and help with new legislation. I'm not an expert on new legislation, but I try and help from a practical perspective in changing the law. So the three areas that I really focus my work on now is helping police officers understand why animal crimes are important and why it's good community policing to help animals too. So the first thing that you need to be able to do that is you need a community policing model. So you need a model which actually engages with the community, tries to build on engagement with the community, perhaps like Ukrainian police work with the schools. If you've got that in place, then what I try and do is to try and help those police officers understand why that community policing should involve animals. It's also important for me to continue to work with animal groups because a lot of animal groups don't understand why activity happens. And very often it's because cases don't actually contain sufficient evidence to be able to get cases to court. So in many instances, you'll read social media and there are a lot of complaints about systems and problems from those who work with animal groups to say that this case should be going to court, this person should be prosecuted, but actually it's the law that's the problem, it's not the police officers. So in that case, you need to tackle the law rather than tackling the police officers and saying they're corrupt. There's actually a fundamental issue that you need to change first. Unless the law is correct, the police officers cannot enforce it. The last thing that's really important for me is delivering a message that community policing strategies should include animals. And that's particularly what I'm going to talk about today when I'm talking about protecting animals, protecting people. So we've heard this message at least 3 times so far, and you're going to hear it again and again. And it's one of the questions why I asked about Petrovska Zoo is that it's obvious that somebody who fails to protect their animals could potentially be failing to protect people. That seems to be logical to me. And the whole One Health message that we heard from Alexandra yesterday, talking about it's not a question of protecting the environment or animals or people, it's about protecting all of them. And Andrew yesterday was also talking about, you know, you can't solve one issue if you don't solve all 3 together. And that's something that I like to reiterate, that I'm not talking, it's not about animal rights, it's not about people rights, it's not about environmental rights. All 3 of those need to work in harmony. But what I will talk about today is how can you use that to influence policing and public protection strategy. So in this conference, which I'm really, really pleased with, I think it's great to work in collaboration. That's what we have to do to help animals. But we've heard fundamentally two different areas that people are talking about. We've heard from a lot of those that have continued to help animals since the 24th of February. And we've heard that they're often the most vulnerable individuals in their community. That's what the groups have been working for, those vulnerable individuals. We've also heard from global experts who've worked with vulnerable adults, children and animals, and who have studied human behaviour. I also know some of the presentations that are coming up, and we'll be going over this. Other experts will be talking about this over the next day and a half. So this image by Max Levin, who we know was killed during the war, is probably one of the most iconic ones for me. And right at the beginning of the conference, I spoke about the Irpin Bridge and images that have gone internationally wide. This image of a police officer helping a family, we're assuming they're a family, cross the Irpin Bridge, it is so iconic of where I think we are at the moment, or where we need to be. This is about community policing. You know, we're assuming this is a man and a wife. He is carrying the family dog rather than their family's possessions, and the police officer is carrying the family possessions as a group. This couldn't be more iconic of what I'm talking about in terms of working as a family unit. And there were so many of these images, fleeing with pets. What the media didn't particularly see was a lot of the images of people leaving them behind, as we saw from Verena and the Kharkiv animal rescue yesterday, people who were leaving animals behind. The media doesn't want to see those bad news stories. So it's great that they've been introduced into this conference. Anybody will know who uses social media. If you put pictures of fluffy kittens on social media, you put puppies, you put people saving dogs, cats from trees, that gets a huge reaction on social media. It's very, very popular to watch. It also creates a lot of emotion. You see a post about animal cruelty, it goes on for ages in relation to people discussing what they're going to do to the person that was involved in it, how serious it is. It creates a lot of emotion, and animal cases create emotion. In the UK Parliament, whenever there are debates about animal welfare issues, what you'll often see is politicians will forget the strategy of what they're supposed to be discussing, and they'll talk about their family pet. So recently we had a lot of discussion talking about creation of new pet theft laws in the United Kingdom. Most of the politicians that wanted to speak in Parliament were talking about how they would feel if their pet was stolen, how it would impact on them. I'm not saying that's a bad thing, but actually it shows that if you target directly at the individuals, the issue of animals within their family, within their community, they will probably understand more. And there's a number of cases around the world where new laws have been launched and changed and considered because that politician has rescued an animal. President Biden, for example, is a great rescuer of animals. The UK has done that. I want to get too political here, but it's happened in the UK too. I think in Greece, the president there was involved in rescuing an animal, and things started to change in relation to legislation. So when politicians have personal experience of animals, their mindset seems to change a little bit. And we've heard a lot over the last day and a half about animals being family in a positive way. So what I'm going to talk about briefly is animals being family, and as far as abusers and criminals are concerned. Now, abusers and criminals always target weak links. That's sort of criminology in very, very simple terms. So with an abuser, that could be through the emotions of their victims, their family units, but it could also be within weak legislation and practice. So for an example, and I'm not going to talk about what some of the other presenters will speak about with the link, it could be about the emotions of their victims through coercive control. It could be convincing a child that animal abuse is acceptable in order to perpetrate abuse against that child. But it could also be about weak legislation. Criminals will exploit gaps in legislation, and they will also exploit gaps in weak practice. Now, relegating animal welfare to a lesser issue is exactly what I mean there. And my other experiences from my policing days in relation to terrorists who travel around the world. They don't want to get caught, so they look for ways to be able to not get caught. So policing's job is to stop that happening. It's quite simple. Police officers, those targeting organised crime, serious criminals, need to get ahead of what they're supposed to be doing. So they need to understand how they operate. And relegating animal welfare to a lesser issue is exactly what animal abusers, whether it's deliberate, whether it's reckless, or whether it's really serious organised animal abuse, perhaps sexual animal abuse, they exploit that gap. So I tend to work with studies, case studies, and there are loads of case studies around the world who show how abusers use animals in crime. This whole link has been known, as far as I'm concerned, at least since 1751. A man called William Hogarth in London produced a series of paintings that showed the transition from a person committing abuse against street animals up to killing his pregnant lover. And they happen in every country, these cases, again and again and again. Because this is a Ukraine conference, I'll talk very briefly about the 21 murders and 8 attempted murders in Dnipro in 2007, committed by Syenko, Suprovnik and Hamza, 3 young men who began their life of violence, capturing street animals, killing them, and then progressed to doing exactly the same things against people. There are a number of series on television, on Netflix, that talk about the link from the transition from animal abuse to being a murderer. Mindhunter, Don't F with Cats, talks about a case in Canada. And I don't know if you get this where in your region, but the program related to Jeffrey Dahmer has just started very recently on Netflix. Very good examples of this whole transition from the way animals are treated to the way people are treated. So this is a little bit of a side conversation, but I think it's important to understand the prosecution system in the United Kingdom because it is slightly different here from other countries, particularly in Europe. Not only that, but within the United Kingdom, we've got at least 3 different systems. So we've got England and Wales, we have Scotland, and we have Northern Ireland, and they're all very slightly different. England and Wales have an adversarial prosecution system as opposed to an inquisitorial system. So essentially that means that you have a defence and a prosecution in court as opposed to the justice directing how the investigation goes. We have 2 systems, a magistrate system and a Crown Court system. Magistrates for less serious offences, Crown Court for more serious offences. Now in theory, we have increased the maximum jail sentence to 5 years for animal cruelty. If the justice system is going to give less than 12 months, it tends to stay in the magistrates, and that's where they can issue banning orders for keeping animals. Police cases go through the Crown Prosecution Service so that there are a set of lawyers who then consider the appropriate charging. We also have charities in the UK, registered charities, and they can actually do prosecutions themselves. They do that under Section 6 of the Prosecution of Offences Act 1985. So a public individual can take a private prosecution through the criminal court system. Most people will know that this is predominantly done by the RSPCA in the UK, founded nearly 200 years ago by Richard Martin, and coincidentally, 200 years ago, that's the first piece of legislation that the UK actually had for animal cruelty. That was the Protection of Cattle Act of 1822. And at that time, there were people saying, you know, this is incredible. The next thing they'll want to do is to protect dogs and cats, which actually that was the next thing that we wanted to do in 1835. But it's still taken us 200 years to understand how that connects to animal cases. In 2019, the RSPCA secured 1,432 convictions in relation to animal welfare offences of varying degrees. Now, their budget, depending on the way you look at it, is roughly £300 million a year. That's a large budget to be able to look after animal welfare, and not every country has that. Charities don't have power of entry to enforce the Animal Welfare Act. They have to rely on the police. I've noted on the bottom of this slide about the Animal and Plant Health Agency and local authority involvement. I recognise that this is a simplistic view. There are a lot of other agencies involved in animal welfare enforcement, but I'm trying to keep it simple for the timescale involved. Charities actually can also carry out prosecution, not only can carry out prosecution investigations, but they can also carry out journalistic type investigations. So what does that look like? That could be an expose, perhaps in the newspaper, in the magazine, on television, or online. Now, broadly, they should be following editorial guidelines. An organisation like the BBC will have a set of conditions that have been pre-written that tell you how you should be carrying out a campaign type investigation. Most of them are done because there's considered to be a public interest. So it could be exposing bad conditions in a a fur farm, or perhaps even in a pig farm, or it's considered to be in the public interest. That's broadly how it works. All charities have to work to charitable objectives, which are pre-written as well. So you can't go outside what you've already said you're going to look at, and that has to be agreed by the Charities Commission. It's commonly known as really being in the court of public opinion. So rather than going through to the magistrates or the Crown Court, what we're going to do is we're going to put this out into the media, because we're going to let the public decide whether they think this is a good thing or a bad thing. And it might help to change legislation. It might help to impact on the way people think. And that can be targeted. So, for example, politicians might read a certain newspaper, watch a certain television program. So your investigation needs to target that particular audience. So when the politician picks up his newspaper on the way to work, he will read about that particular issue. So he'll read about that particular thing that you want to change the law about. So that's kind of how campaigning using campaign type investigations operates. Now, other countries across Europe particularly don't have this. They tend to have their systems work to the Ministry of the Interior or an equivalent. But police response is normally for most public protection, so they don't tend to have charities. It's normally police officers that are responsible for the protection of animals and people. Animal rescues can either be privately or publicly owned. There's less money, as I mentioned, usually in other countries than the UK on looking after animal welfare. Across from one country to another, there's huge differences. Greece has now got a 10-year maximum jail sentence for animal cruelty. Some countries only issue a fine, so there's a huge variance. But most countries within their law divide abuse and welfare into two levels. So misdemeanor, which is probably about neglect, and felony, which is probably about deliberate or reckless cruelty. So how do you integrate animal welfare into existing strategy? Now, political strategy rarely includes animal welfare as a priority. We all try and make different political parties make animal cruelty a serious issue, but it very rarely is top of their agenda. Policing and public protection strategy is very similar. I don't know of any police service that has protection of animals as one of its priority key indicators that it has to deal with. But it will have domestic violence, murder, crimes that we will hear over the last day and a half and the next day and a half linked to animal cruelty. Local and municipal strategies will also be about stray animal management, potentially. But when they are, it's normally about public health. It's not about animal welfare. It's about the spread of rabies. It's about the fact that children might be bitten by street dogs. It's very rarely about the welfare of the street dog. I've mentioned on here farm or wild animals because it gets really complicated if I start talking about every animal within half an hour, but I'm very aware that we mustn't simply be talking about companion animals. So when I look at public protection, if I look at, and for the purpose of this presentation, I went through the ministry and the policing public protection strategies of Ukraine, United Kingdom, Romania, and Moldova. And I've simplified them here into one paragraph. So in Ukraine, the public protection strategy is combating crime, maintaining public safety and the rule of law, and creating a safe environment for people's lives. The United Kingdom's policing strategy will be aligned and, where appropriate, integrated with other local public services to improve outcomes for citizens and protect the vulnerable. Romania, the public protection strategy is a protection of fundamental rights with liberties of the citizens and private and public property, prevention and identification of criminal offences and their perpetrators. And then lastly, Moldova, I couldn't find the ministry strategy here, but the policing strategy, the last one that I could read, aims at establishing a force serving the interests of citizens and community. So I broke those public protection strategies into one paragraph. And on the next slide, I've actually done it into a few words. So they're talking about safe environments, protecting the vulnerable, prevention and identification of criminal offences, and serving the interests of citizens. Now, we know that the safest societies are those in which the vulnerable individuals are protected, and that includes animals. So why, when you're developing a protection strategy for everybody in the community, and you've already said that this is what your strategy is, it is effectively your mission statement, why would you not include animals when you're trying to create a safe society? You already said you're going to do that, so you should be doing that with animals. Now, at a time of war or any other stressful time, as we heard Andrew talking about at the end of his presentation yesterday, all potentially vulnerable members of society require protection. And what I've talked about in the next paragraph is I've simplified what are considered to be the 5 freedoms for animal welfare. But actually, which are obviously care, food, shelter, freedom from pain. But if you imagine perhaps an elderly person who is in a nursing home or some kind of hospital, they also require us to care for them. They need food given to them. They expect shelter. They expect freedom from pain, abuse, illness, and a freedom to be able to express themselves. You know, someone gets older, perhaps they're in their 80s or 90s and they're in a home, they should at least be able to have freedom of speech, be able to act as they did when they were younger. To take that away would be considered to be wrong, a human rights issue. So to take that away from animals must be an animal rights issue. It's all part of public protection. We know when animals are given that protection, that people are safer too. So tomorrow you're going to hear from a great police officer and psychologist from Greece, but this is a comment which I heard this summer from someone who runs an animal welfare group on an island in Greece, who said that something amazing has happened here on our island. You know, the chief of police and a few police officers went to a workshop in Athens, and it was held by an organisation that highlighted the link between animal abuse and domestic violence. And they became completely sensitised, and they've been on our side ever since and helping us crack down on animal abuse tremendously. And it's made such a difference on the island, such a difference. And now they say, we work together like this. They understand us and they're our allies. So I'm going to give you a couple of examples here from England and Wales and Greece of where this can happen. Now, hare coursing, for those that don't know, in predominantly England, Wales and Ireland and some other countries in Europe, is where men use dogs to chase hares, partly for enjoyment in killing the hare, but also to bet money on it. It's not a policing priority in ahead of murder, but it is a policing priority, and a lot of resources are put into tackling it. But it's not because it's an animal welfare issue. It's because of the links with cross-border acquisitive crime. So those that are involved in in hare coursing will potentially travel 200 miles, and during that 200-mile trip, they will commit crime in various police areas while they're doing so. That's why coordinated police response has been put in place to be able to tackle it. Also, the humans that are affected by it do have additional influence in the community. They are very often high up members of the community, but predominantly the reason it's been put on there is because it links to other types of crime. Dogfighting is a vehicle that opens all sorts of doors to additional policing and political resource. We know there are inextricable links with dogfighting, gun crime, drug crime. A case in Piraeus in Greece that I was involved in started off as a dogfighting case. In the end, there were 35 people arrested, 19,000 euros recovered, and 30 odd crimes were detected of causing explosions and running a protection racket. Guns were recovered and fighting dogs were recovered because it started off as a dogfighting case. It's also highly likely that the dogfighting investigations that were done to expose the horrific nature of pitting dogs together simply for entertainment for up to 4 hours was what helped increase the jail terms in England and Wales. Okay, so how does this connect to the war situation? Because predominantly this conference is about animals at war. Now, when you listen to what you, Paul, was saying, what Kharkiv Animal Rescue is saying, and what you'll hear later today, we must keep increased aid flowing for refugees fleeing with animals. So we need to highlight that animals are part of the community, part of the family unit, and they shouldn't be separated. Traditionally, humanitarian aid has been spoken about as it's for families, to keep families alive. But as Andrew was saying, think of the relationship, particularly in highly stressful situations between animals and people. Humanitarian aid should never just be for people. It isn't a question about animals or people, but it's a question of both working together. That is one unit. That's one partnership, one relationship, one family unit, one community. It's not a question of either or. Those that are working tirelessly to help animals at local and national level should be taken seriously. Very often, public bodies dismiss those involved in animal welfare as animal rights extremists, emotive individuals. It's time to take what they are doing seriously, because they're not just helping animals, they're making safer communities for all of us. At the same time, listening to Marina yesterday, we must keep the animal laws, new animal laws going. We can't stop progress in terms of what needs to be done. Listening to Maria today in all the different pieces of legislation that need to change for animal welfare. Yes, I understand there are other priorities, but if we don't start, or we don't continue to tackle animal abuse and create new legislation, then we will be having problems for the future. We'll be having more murders in future, more violent crimes for happening within our communities. That will lead to a dwindling of resource in policing and public protection individuals. So we have to keep that going even in wartime. It will slow down, but we must continue the progress. And we need to learn, that's what the conference is about. It's about sharing knowledge and experiences and learning. I didn't realize that shelters like Borodyanka, as an example, didn't have a strategy about what happens if something goes wrong. And as a result, 222 dogs died. All shelters should have some kind of plan. I know you can't cater for every eventuality, but there should be some kind of contingency plan. There is for most types of bodies. What happens if things go wrong? Okay, so what's next then? So within the conference, what happens next is there's going to be some more excellent speakers. I've got some advanced knowledge of what people are going to speak about, and it's definitely worth listening to. If you haven't seen yesterday's, they're all available on YouTube. Go back and watch them again in whatever language you would like to watch them in. It's a great holistic view of animal welfare and public protection. The speakers will not only cover companion animals, but looking at farm animals, wild animals, all animals in the community. And there's some great international expertise on how animal welfare interlinks with every community. Ukraine and the neighbouring countries will continue to develop and support effective aid structures. And I think we can all learn from what's happened. When you listen to the progress from the 24th of February through what you, Paul, have done, and I know we hear about from You Animals tomorrow, and open cages today and tomorrow. Hear how, learn from that, and so that when it happens in another country, and it will, that we don't go through exactly the same situation as an international team and international community. And not to develop mission fatigue. I don't know whether that's a phrase that translates particularly well, but it's getting bored with an issue. So, everybody wanted to help the animals of Ukraine on the 25th of February. By the time we get to Christmas, other things would have come up. People have had other priorities. The animals' lives haven't changed. They still need exactly the same help they needed on the 25th of February. In fact, they probably need more help because the situation has deteriorated. Globally, we need to continue to find ways to get animal welfare into existing priorities at local and national level. So the community strategy about stray animal management should include welfare of the animals as well as public protection. Protection of a city's plans should be about how we're going to keep the society safe from individuals who threaten us. You know, if, say, go back and watch some of those series of, like Dharma on Netflix, the number of times that the police officers had an opportunity to prevent people being killed in that community and didn't take it. We missed so many chances. And the other important thing is Naturewatch Foundation, who I'm really proud to be doing work with at the moment. Been there for 30 years, had a 30-year anniversary, been working with Ukraine for much of that time. And Naturewatch would really enjoy being part of that journey, helping, because we have to work as one team. I think the animals deserve that. So that's my presentation. If anybody wants to contact me, please do so through my email in relation to any of this. If I can help at all, if Naturewatch can help at all, please do contact us.